Hey guys, welcome back. This is our chapter 3, Black People in Colonial North America lecture. We're looking at Black people in Colonial North America from 1526 to 1763. So some questions we're looking to answer. Who were the peoples of Colonial North America? How did black servitude develop in the Chesapeake? And what were the characteristics of plantation slavery from 1700 to 1750? All right. How did the experience of African Americans under French and Spanish rule in North America compare to that in the British colonies? How did slavery affect black women in colonial America, and how did African Americans resist slavery? All right. So African American or African immigrants um, uh, gave birth to the African American people, and African Americans will shape a new way of life. So they will leave an indelible mark on the New World. They will exchange culture with the Europeans. They will influence the diet, the music, the literature, philosophy of the Europeans and Native Americans that they interact with. African Americans, Native Americans, and whites had complex relationships and interacted in a number of ways. So a lot of times we like to try to think of these things as cookie cutter, sort of, but black people and white people frequently had families together, as did Native Americans and white people, and Native Americans and black people. They all fought with each other. Sometimes Native Americans, um, uh, you know, owned black slaves. Sometimes black people and white people fought together against Native Americans. Sometimes Native Americans sheltered escaped slaves. So there's no really kind of neat sort of relationship structure here. It's very complex, as you might expect. All right. Um, Prior to Columbus, the Americas were inhabited between 50 and 100 million people. All right, there were numerous societies that existed here. They were complex. They had dense populations. They had cities that rivaled their contemporaries. Like Cahokia had 30,000 people, which certainly would have rivaled London at the time. Native Americans had been in North America for at least 12,000 years, having crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. You have the Anasazi and the Pueblo in the Southwest, who lived in an agricultural society. They studied astronomy. They had advanced, pottery and other art forms. They lived in large towns and even cities. The Mississippian culture, by the way, um, Cahokia, largest city, and then the Woodlands region, the Adena culture, are known for their burial mounds. So we don't talk extensively about Native American history in this class, but it's worthwhile to take a course on it because there's a lot to learn. And we tend to think, just like I mentioned, that we think of Africa and Africans as monolithic. A lot of times Native Americans get the same treatment, and that's intentional because back in the day when the U.S. government wanted to take lands from Native Americans, they would just go find one person from one group and have them sign a treaty as if they represented everybody. So it's been kind of a mindset to treat them as a monolith for a long time, but they're not. uh, Very complex society, all sorts of different agriculture and religion and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I digress. um, Native American crops were critical, and they're going to change the diets of both people in Europe and the African Americans that end up in the New World. So things like corn, pumpkin, squash, beans, and tobacco are going to have quite the impact. Native Americans had very complex relationships with black people. They provided refuge to black slaves. Sometimes Indians were slaveholders and helped crush slave revolts. Sometimes black men participated in the Indian slave trade. Sometimes black men fought against Indians alongside whites, and they had complex social and sexual relationships, those three groups. So it's it's not this neat little confined, strict system, right? That you might think. All right. So in the Spanish Empire, the Spanish didn't come to the New World in large numbers. They were here to get stuff. They were here to make money. they weren't really coming here to people these new lands. So as a result, many enslaved Africans and Native Americans gained their freedom. Spanish, African, and Native customs intermingled and created new, unique cultures in the New World. All right. So you guys should know the first permanent British colony in North America was Jamestown. We like to say that Jamestown was established in 1607. So we really wouldn't call, the 1607 Jamestown permanent or really even established, because they basically all die a couple of times. Like the settlement's virtually wiped out. Everybody starves to death. There's even some cannibalism. Things get pretty ugly. They came here looking for gold. The original ship's manifest included a number of gentlemen, which, if you can't tell by the title, they don't do a lot of manual labor, and so they all died. And it wasn't until later waves of Jamestown settlers came and farmed and produced that it was able to actually establish itself. So they didn't find gold. There's not really a lot of gold in Virginia, but there is good soil, and so tobacco becomes the primary source of revenue and ends up being very profitable rather. White laborers produced most tobacco in the Chesapeake colonies initially. These are the indentured servants that you're used to hearing about. So indentured servitude was used initially. 1619, the first people of African descent arrived in Jamestown. It was a Dutch ship. There were 20 Angolans. Remember, we talked about Africa south of the Sahara, Central Africa. A large minority of African Americans trace their ancestry. Most are from West Africa. Well, think about where Angola is. These Angolans weren't free, okay? They also weren't slaves. So this is tricky because according to English moral code, it was illegal, it was immoral to enslave Christians. And many of these Angolans were, in fact, Christians. So they weren't free, but they weren't slaves. Not all of them, anyway. So from the 1620s to 1670s, you had black and white indentured servants working side by side. All right. And by the way, an indentured servant is not the same thing as a slave. This is something that pops up on Facebook every now and then, where they talk about Irish slaves. It's a myth. There's no such thing. Okay, so there were no Irish slaves brought to the New World. They were indentured servants. They worked for a period of 7 years in exchange for their for passage to the New World. They were treated as humans. Their children weren't born indentured or enslaved. They couldn't be murdered or raped arbitrarily, or so that I could go on. There's absolutely no comparison between enslaved African Americans and indentured servants. So both black and white could expect to eventually work off their contract. For a time period, free black men owned land. When we watch the video on the African Americans, you'll learn about Anthony Johnson, who was a well-to-do black landowner. He was actually able to sue his neighbor and win in court. Okay, they lent and borrowed money, served as jurors, voted, etc. So you're thinking, okay, this was going on in the South in the early 17th century. What the heck happened? Because it certainly didn't stay that way. So what it really came down to was the ideology of black people being regarded as inherently different than whites was already there. Black people were regarded as alien, and this regard became the basis for what historians call the unthinking decision. Basically, the transition from this sort of mixed labor system to one entirely based on race. So between 1640 and 1700, the tobacco colonies, which stretched from North Carolina up to Delaware, transitioned from white servitude, or white indentured servitude rather, to black slavery. So look, 1660s, this is slavery, 1680s, 1700s. There's a clear transition, rapid transition. All right. This is not something that the British colonists came up with on their own. There was a strong precedent for enslaved labor in the Sugar Islands as early as the 16th century. Remember, we talked about this. You had things getting a little better in Europe. so there was less supply of indentured servitude. You had British naval preeminence, which meant the slave trade was less costly. You had notions of English superiority, which made a race-based labor system more likely. Here's the other thing. Indentured servants were viewed as dangerous, okay, because they'd eventually work off their freedom. And so essentially, well, I'll talk about Bacon's Rebellion in a moment. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Children of black female servants were slaves for life. This was counter to English law, where they said your status is derived from your father. So they changed it to suit their needs. Enslaved Africans and African Americans were treated worse than domestic animals. All right, think about that. Like if a horse breaks free and runs off, you just go and you get the horse and you bring it back. If an enslaved person gets free, you go and you bring them back, and then you chop off the front third of their foot. Okay, and that happened frequently. By the way, it was called hobbling. So they were treated worse than domestic animals. Masters who killed slaves were not charged with murder. Slaves were accountable for all transgressions, both theirs and their masters. Black slaves and white indentured servants at one point unite against the elite. This is Bacon's Rebellion. All right, they rose up against the wealthy class. This is like a potential watershed moment here. Could enslaved black people and poor white indentured servants rise up and unseat the aristocracy and create a new free society? Not so much. Bacon died before the rebellion could really take root. The elite, for their part, realized the danger of freed white indentured servants, and they were like, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to, and by the way, this is not like a conscious immediate decision, but there was a realization and a conscious switch. So they said, we are going to placate poor whites, give them a little bit of land, break off a little bit, and then just rely on enslaved black labor over which we can exert total control. And so basically what the elites did is they predicated white freedom and prosperity on denying blacks the same. So essentially the wealthy elite, this guy would say, okay, like Trey Crowder really put it best. And I'll show you guys the video in class. But he basically said, there's a black person and a white person, and there's 10 cookies, and along comes a wealthy planter, and he takes 9 of the cookies, and then he looks at the poor white person and he says, hey, that black person's trying to take your cookie, right? So they just pitted them against each other and basically made white freedom and prosperity dependent on black oppression, right? And it's tragic. All right, so in the tobacco colonies, all right, the economy was dependent, and in the Deep South and in the rice colonies, and I'll differentiate between those later. But around the Chesapeake, you have tobacco. Rice is grown in the low country in the Deep South, like South Carolina and Georgia. Slave labor is the driving force. Living conditions varied. So around the Chesapeake and other places, sometimes you'd have masters that owned a smaller number of slaves and worked closely with their slaves. Some masters had huge land holdings, and their overseers worked with the slaves, especially in South Carolina. You'd have a massive rice plantation, and then the owner of that plantation did not stay there. South Carolina was hot and humid, so they would stay in Charleston by the water, and their overseers would manage things. Before the 18th century, almost all slaves were field workers. So masters wanted slaves to work harder and faster. So, they came up with different means of encouraging that. So African men were looked at as agricultural laborers, but in Africa, agricultural labor was viewed as a feminine occupation, so there was some reluctance. By the time we get to 1750, the South has numerous black artisans. So these are skilled black tradespeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, shoemakers, etc. Plantation owners were loath to pay for anything. So if they could train their slaves to do it, they would. So you have basically in the middle colonies, you had a skilled middle class, and in New England, you had a skilled middle class, and in the South, you had a skilled middle class. They were the skilled middle class in the South were enslaved people. Black women worked in fields and in the homes. Okay, so you can kind of see the number of slaves, right, and the year. You guys can pause the slide if you want to look at the chart. Okay. So low country refers to like South Carolina and Georgia, the deep South, okay, during the colonial period. They used the West Indian plantation system, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. A lot of the British settlers in this part of the colonies were from Barbados, and they brought their slaves with them. So the slaves that they brought with them were already property or chattel. And so this became also the center of the Indian slave trade, which went on for a while. But remember, the Native Americans were killed pretty quickly by Old World diseases. So enslaved Native Americans died pretty rapidly, and there were very few left, and they were pushed west. Rice plantations were common in the Low Country, similar to the West Indies. Rice cultivation and slavery spread to Georgia by the 1750s. So in 1740, you had about 40,000 slaves around Charleston, which represented 90% of the population around Charleston. So 90% of the population around Charleston were enslaved people. And so observers that would travel there would say, South Carolina appears to be like an African society rather than a European settlement, because white people were few and far between. So as a result of that population dynamic, the white people that lived there were afraid all the time of slave uprisings. So they feared black people, but they needed them. Rice had to be cultivated extensively. So you have to, in order to profit from rice production, you have to grow lots and lots and lots of it. All right, so what we also get out of this is a distinct sort of class system. This is where we get the beginnings of colorism in our society. So like lighter skin versus darker skin. Black people had different roles and different privileges. So Creoles, who are, you know, and mixed race relatives of masters, sometimes lived right alongside whites. And you might even have free light-skinned black people living in Charleston. Although they certainly didn't have the same privileges as whites, there were special rules that applied to them. Something that's interesting is even though conditions were harsher in the Low Country, black people that were on Low Country plantations actually had more autonomy, because the masters all lived in like, you know, breezy Charleston. They weren't at the plantation. So you had more freedom, even though your life expectancy was shorter and your life was harsher on the rice plantations. All right, because all the planters preferred to be in Charleston and Savannah. All right, so the 18th century slave quarters was, you know, minimal and usually a temporary shelter. They had some basic items. We've got a lot of archaeological evidence to support this. You know, the furniture, the cooking utensils. If you really want to get an idea of it, you've got to go to the museum in DC, because they actually have an entire reconstructed slave house inside the museum, which is huge, by the way. And you can really see how folks lived. So in the early years of the colonies, all the cloth came from England. So, but later on, you know, there was homespun fabric produced by slaves. Their clothing mirrored that of West Africa. There's that endurance of West African culture. Just one example of it, by the way. West African culture is going to endure in a number of ways. All right. And just like in the Caribbean, slaves will have their own food plots that they can sometimes, but not often, gain a little bit of profit of. But most of the time, it's just for subsistence. All right, so Africans, whites, and Native Americans mix. They exchange culture. they had interracial sexual contact. That's what this term miscegenation means. And we're going to talk a lot about that later on in terms of miscegenation laws, anti-miscegenation laws that were created in the United States. You guys know who these folks are. I'll give you a hint. They lived in King and Queen. There's a very famous Supreme Court case. The first anti-miscegenation law in Virginia was passed in 1691. It was repealed in 1967. So their case, the people in this picture, their Supreme Court case, repealed the laws that said black people and white people couldn't marry. Do you know who they are? They're the Lovings. This is Richard Loving. This is Mildred Loving. So they live right down the road from you, just two regular folks whose crime was going up to D.C. and getting married. Their case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they got the laws that had been around since 1691 repealed. So, heck of a story. We'll watch the movie before the course is over. All right, so second generation African Americans lost their ethnic identity and most, but not all of their language, but they kept their West African heritage, and they very intentionally passed it on to their descendants. Things like words and terms, music, their diet, the way they cooked, folk literature, those trickster tales, were all preserved. Extended family units were preserved. Those kinship ties that I talked about that were formed in the absence of biological family members persevered. And they often passed on fathers' and grandfathers' names. Okay? So the Great Awakening was an important moment for black people in colonial North America. Remember, the Great Awakening was a religious movement. And the Great Awakening was a religious movement that challenged authority because George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards were not the official, ordained, authorized ministers. They were out under the tree preaching, right? And this was a time when church attendance was mandatory, but people were flaunting the rules, and they were going to go hear, Edwards and Whitefield and other Great Awakening ministers preach. So they're breaking the rules, and this was a time when you didn't really do that. They didn't take it for granted that you could challenge authority. The Great Awakening is also more egalitarian. If you go to the official church, there's a seat up front for the landowners, and the further back you sit, the lower you are, and that's not the way it is under the tree with the Great Awakening ministers. It's first come, first serve. All right. So African Americans were converting in large numbers, and they began to view salvation of the soul as liberation of the body. You can imagine how salvation of the soul would become important to people who were in literal bondage. Hey, I can liberate my body, I can liberate my soul by obtaining salvation. So the Great Awakening resonated with enslaved African Americans. All right, language, music, and folk literature have West African traditions, and that continues to be the case in a big way today. African American words, grammatical elements were combined with English structure, so they created a unique dialect here. The musical traditions, such as improvisation, which, by the way, it becomes the foundation for a very popular music form later on called bebop jazz, which is all about improvisation, which is going to be wildly popular with audiences, both white and black, which is going to basically undergird modern musical art forms, so big stuff. Call and response, complex rhythms and strong beats, drums, horns, and banjo are all West African instruments. The banjo is a West African instrument. And so you can see where the roots of American music stylings lie in West African musical traditions. But, huge influence. West African proverbs such as riddles and trickster tales will also endure, and we are all familiar with those. All right. African Americans would often perform English ballads for white audiences, but they would use African styles, and this was very popular. Black women raised masters' children, and those children adopted African American speech patterns and intonations. Black folk remedies became very popular among whites, and black cooking became very popular among white Southerners. Things like barbecue, collard greens, and fried chicken. So, like, there's like some negative stereotypes associated with these, but these are distinctly Southern, culinary traditions, and they're introduced by African Americans. So you could just see how, in the way people talk, in the music they listen to, in the entertainment, in the food that they eat, and the things that they read, there's a strong African American influence and a strong West African cultural heritage that's part of that. All right. It's pretty incredible when you think of it, and I'll go back, but this is a group of people who are supposed to be totally controlled, enslaved, dehumanized, etc. But really, they're molding and shaping the society around them in really fundamental ways. So they're making a huge impact. Percent of the population who are African or African American, middle colonies in New England, you can see is sort of stays low. British West Indies takes off quite a bit, and then the lower South and the Chesapeake gets trending upward. So by the time we get to 1860, you got about 9 million people living in the South, and about half of them are black. All right. In the northern colonies, you are going to have slavery, and in fact, it's going to persist well into the 19th century, as far north as New York. You know, like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, you're going to find it go away sooner, but slavery is not going to go away in Pennsylvania. It's not going to go away in New York until well into the 19th century. But certainly in the northern colonies, you're going to see a growing abolitionist movement and a departure from slavery and embrace of a more diverse economy, whereas the South is going to stay totally dependent on plantation agriculture. So, but anyway, so Quakers in Pennsylvania brought their abolitionist beliefs with them from England. The Society of Friends, created in England, will be exported to the colonies. And so the Quakers are your first white abolitionists. The northern colonies are a cooler climate. There was lots of people living there, so there's more white labor. They didn't really do cash crop agriculture. So the slavery-based plantation system is not going to take root there. They're going to end up with a diverse economy that includes agriculture, that includes a skilled middle class, that includes commerce. That being said, black people will make up a very small portion of the northern population, just 4.5%, compared to well over 40% of the southern population at the time. Those that were slaves in the north found their treatment a little bit better. There wasn't the same constant, pervasive fear of slave uprising that caused white people to try to exercise absolute power over slaves. And so opportunities to learn to read, go to church, things like that. And in fact, we see enslaved people in the north sorry, I lost my train of thought. Basically, literature, artwork is going to be a result of that. So sorry, I got a little off track there. All right, so black men were valued more highly than black women in colonial America because of the labor needs. So black women worked in the fields until giving birth. All right. Later on, black women are going to be valued because, like I said, the House of Burgesses is going to make it so that things are matrilineal, so that children born to black women will be born into slavery, and they're going to economically incentivize rape. And so that's going to become something later on. So you had field workers and you had house servants. Women that worked in as house servants were often exploited. Well, field workers too were often exploited sexually, and this could be a relationship where the master was doing it for economic reasons, preying on women for a number of reasons, but it was common. It happened all the time. This pervasive culture of raping female slaves was a big part of the institution of slavery that we can't overlook, as uncomfortable as it is to talk about. So slavery in America relied on physical force, all right, but there was constant resistance. One thing that was done was sabotage, intentionally injure a farm animal, damage a piece of equipment, or just slow down the work process. They would poison their masters. Some would escape. Often escapees would group together and establish maroon communities. These were communities kind of out off the beaten path, away from, like sort of inaccessible. Rebellious slaves in Charleston stole ammunition and plundered plantations. In our primary source, materials, we see slave masters constantly sort of fretting how rebellious and uncooperative their slaves were. And this is something that just continues right up until the end. So that during the Civil War, we get, plantation owners writing with dismay in their journals that they're shocked that as soon as the Union Army showed up, all their slaves walked right off the plantation and never looked back. And so at no point in the institution of slavery are enslaved people content. That is a myth that has been perpetuated over the years, first by pro-slavery people and then by Southern apologists, that slaves were somehow content or treated well or anything to that effect. They were never treated properly. It was a cruel institution where they were murdered and raped arbitrarily. They were never content with their status as slaves and constantly fought back against it from the time they were put on a ship to later generations who were born into it. So I can't emphasize that enough. White Southerners during the entire institution of slavery lived in constant fear of slave revolt. So in fact, the Southern states had huge standing armies throughout their entire existence and even as colonies. And it wasn't because they were afraid of, being attacked by some foreign aggressor. They maintained large, huge militias compared to northern states because they were constantly scared to death that their slaves were going to revolt. So like Virginia would have a standing militia that dwarfed all the other states in size because they were like, we got to keep all these men under arms in case there's a large-scale slave revolt, which there were frequently. And we'll talk later on about Nat Turner. We'll talk later on about Gabriel Prosser. We'll talk about Delandes, excuse me, and other famous slave revolts. All right. So in conclusion, the history of Black people in North America, well, and in the New World in general, is painful, but it's exhilarating because we can see the impact that they had here and how they shaped this place and how the America that we know today, the culture that we know today, they played a major role in its creation. Enslavement and racism resulted in a loss of African heritage, but much of that sort of persevered, and there were a lot of new sort of African American cultural traditions that were created. Resistance was constant and enduring. They forged new family ties, new kinship ties, and developed a distinct African American culture. All right, that concludes our Chapter 3 lecture, guys. Make sure you guys do the discussion board, fill out those guided notes, and answer the chapter questions, and I will see you next time.